Chapter 7 of Dr. Nikola's Experiment by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. In the preceding chapter, I made you acquainted with the calamity which befell our patient, and of the serious position in which I found myself placed with Nikola in consequence. While knowing in my own heart that I was quite innocent of any intentional neglect of duty, I had yet to remember that I had remained on watch instead of leaving the room to ascertain what had befallen the Donna Consuelo. It would, in all probability, never have occurred. On the other hand, I had signalled Dr. Nikola and called him to my assistance before abandoning my charge. How it was that he had not answered my summons was more than I can understand. As it transpired afterwards, however, and as is usual in such things, the explanation was a very simple one. In the last chapter I said that when he left me to go to the laboratory, he was quite exhausted. He had eaten nothing for many hours, and as a natural result the fumes of the herbs he was distilling had overpowered him, and he had fallen in a dead faint upon the floor. As long as I live I shall retain the recollection of the next 14 hours. During the whole of that time Nikola and I fought death inch by inch for the body of the old Don. From midnight until the following afternoon neither of us crossed the threshold of the sick chamber, and during the whole of that time, save to give me brief directions, Nikola spoke no word to me at all. It was only when the mercury in the clinical thermometer was once more established on its accustomed mark that he addressed me. Rearranging the bed covering and wiping his clammy forehead with his pocket handkerchief, he turned to me. "I think he will do now," he said. "Provided he does not lose ground within the next half hour, we may take it for granted that he is out of danger." This was the opportunity for which I was waiting. I accordingly seized it. "I am afraid, Dr. Nikola," I said, mustering courage as I progressed, "that you consider me to blame for what has happened." He looked sharply at me, and then said coldly, "I fail to see how I could very well think otherwise. I left you in charge, and you deserted your post." "But I assure you," I continued, "that you are misjudging me. I could not help myself. I heard the girl scream and ran to her assistance. At the same time I took care to ring the bell for you before I left the room." "You should not have left it at all until I had joined you," he answered, with the still same icy tone. "As a matter of fact, I did not hear your summons. I had fainted. And the other question, what was the girl doing in this portion of the castle?" "She was hysterical," I answered, "and was searching for her great-grandfather. She did not know herself how she got here, but as ill luck would have it, she saw your terrible people, and was frightened nearly to death in consequence. For common humanity's sake I could not leave her as she was. Having rung for you, I naturally thought you were with the Don, and that I was free to render her what assistance I could. Your argument is certainly plausible, but supposing the man had died during your absence, how would you have felt then?" "I should have regretted it all my life," I answered. "But surely you must admit that would have been better than that young girl should have been driven mad by fear." "You do not seem to understand," Nikola replied, "that I would willingly sacrifice 1,000 girls to accomplish this great object I have in view. No, no, Ingleby, you have been found wanting in your duty. You have checked the progress of the experiment. If that old man had died—" Here he took a step towards me. His face suddenly became livid with passion. "As I live at this moment, you would never have seen the light of day again. I swear I would have killed you with as little compunction as I would have destroyed a dog who had bitten me." So menacing was his attitude, and so fiendish the expression on his face, that I instinctively recoiled a step from him. However, I don't think my worst enemy could accuse me of being a coward. Was the man a lunatic, I asked myself? Had the magnitude of his discovery turned his head? If so, I must be careful in my dealings with him. "I'm afraid I do not understand you, Dr. Nikola," I said, trying to appear calmer than I really felt. "You talk in an exaggerated fashion, and one which I cannot permit. I confess to being a certain measure to blame for what has happened, but if you feel that you can no longer repose trust in me that you once did, I would rather resign my post and leave your house at once." For a moment I thought I detected a sign of fear in his face. Then his manner changed completely. "My dear Ingleby," he said, patting me on my shoulder and speaking in quite a different tone, "if I hurt your feelings just now, I hope you will forgive me and ascribe it to my anxiety. For the last 2 days, as you are aware, I have been overwrought. I stated that I considered you to blame. I said more than I meant, for of course I know that you had no intention of injuring our patient, or of doing anything to prejudice the end that we have in view. It was a combination of unfortunate circumstances, the ill effects of which, by good luck, we have been able to remedy. Let us forget all about it." "With all my heart," I said, with a momentary friendliness I have never felt for him before, and held out my hand to him. He took it, and when, to my surprise, I found that his hand was as cold as ice. In this fashion the cloud between us appeared to have blown away, but though it was no longer visible to the naked eye, it still existed, for I was unable to dispel from my mind the recollection of the threat he had used to me. If he were not in earnest now, he had at least been so then, and for my own part I put more faith in his threats than in his protestations of friendship. "Come, come, this will never do," said Nikola, after a few moments' silence which had followed after our reconciliation. "It is nearly 3 o'clock. You had better go to your room and rest for a couple of hours, after which you can relieve me." Seeing his haggard and weary face, I offered to remain on duty while he went to lie down, but to this he would not consent. It was plain he was still brooding over what had happened, and that he did not intend to trust me any further than he was absolutely obliged. Accordingly, I did not press him, but as soon as I had noted the various temperatures, and had done what I could to help him, I left him to his vigil and went to my own apartment. I had had 19 hours in the sick room, and in consequence was completely worn out. During that time I had heard nothing of the Dona Consuelo. When I laid my head upon my pillow and closed my eyes, her terrified face, as I had seen it the previous night, rose before me. Even then I could feel the thrill which had run through me as I took that lovely body in my arms. What place was this terrible castle, I asked myself, for such a woman? How dreary was the life she was compelled to lead in it, without companions, cut off from the one person who only a week before had been all the world to her. This suggested another and sweeter thought to me. Was there only one person she loved? I remembered how she had clung to me in the hall, and how she had appealed to me to save her. The mere thought that there might be something more than simple liking in her attitude was sufficient to set my heart beating like a sledge-hammer. Was it possible that I could be falling in love? I, who had thought myself done with that sort of thing for ever. I smiled at the idea. A nice sort of position I was in to contemplate such a thing. And yet I was so lonely in the world that it soothed me to think there might be someone to whom I was a little more than the average man, and that someone was a beautiful and noble woman. With these thoughts in my brain I fell asleep. A moment later, so it seemed, the electric bell above my head brought me wide awake again. One glance at my watch was sufficient, however, to show me that I had been asleep 2 hours. I dressed as quickly as possible and returned to the Don's room, where, much to my relief, Nikola informed me there had been no relapse, and that all was progressing as satisfactorily as he could wish. Bidding me exercise the greatest vigilance, he left me and staggered from the room. "A little more of this sort of thing, my friend," I said to myself as I watched him pass out of the door. "Only a little more, and you will be unfit for anything." But I had yet to learn the strength of Nikola's constitution. He was like a steel bow. He might often be bent, but never broken. It was not until the following morning that I saw Dona Consuelo again. We met upon the battlements as usual. "Dr. Ingleby," she said, after we had been standing together some time, "I feel there is something I should say to you. I want to tell you how sorry I am for what occurred the other night. But for my folly in wandering about the castle as I did, I should not have seen—" She paused for a moment, and a shudder swept over her face at the recollection. "I should not have seen what I did, and you would not have got into trouble with Dr. Nikola." "How do you know that I did get into trouble with Dr. Nikola?" I asked. "Because Dr. Nikola spoke to me about it," she replied. On hearing this, I pricked up my ears. Had Nikola taken her to task for what she had done? In all probability he had blamed her. I tried to catch her on this point, but she would tell me nothing. "You will accept my apology, won't you?" she asked. "It has made me so unhappy." "You must apologise to me at all," I answered. "I assure you none is needed. I would have given anything to have prevented your seeing, well, what you did, and still more to have prevented Nikola from speaking to you. He had no right to do so." Then, drawing a little closer to her, I took her hand. "Dona Consuelo," I said, "I am very much afraid your life here is a very unhappy one." "I was happier in Spain," she answered, "but I do not want you to think that I am grumbling. You have given me your promise that no ill shall befall my great-grandfather, and for this reason I have no fear. If he is well, what right have I to complain of anything that may happen to myself? Some day, perhaps, Dr. Nikola will allow us to go back to Spain, and then I shall forget all about this terrible castle." I wondered if the hope she entertained would ever be realized, but I was not going to permit her to suppose that I entertained any doubt at all about it. I felt I should like to have said more, but prudence restrained me. She looked so beautiful that the temptation was almost more than I could withstand. Whether she knew anything of what was in my mind, I cannot say, but somehow I fancied she must have done so. Though I have no desire to appear conceited, I could not help thinking when we bade each other good-bye there was a look of sorrow in her face. Once more a fortnight went by. A month had now elapsed since our arrival at the castle, and as I could plainly see, Nikola's experiment was at length achieving a definite result. The changes effected by the use of electric batteries and the constant anointing which I have already described having ceased within a short time of the removal of the means by which they were occasioned, were now almost permanent, and were becoming more so every day. The patient's flesh was firmer, his skin more elastic, while his usual pallor had given place to what might be almost described as a healthy tint. So far success had crowned Nikola's endeavours, but whether the final result would be what he desired was more than I could say. After the little contretemps which followed my mistake already described, Nikola and I had agreed fairly well together. I was aware, however, that he was suspicious of my intimacy with the old Don's great-granddaughter, and from the way in which he glanced at the patient and the various instruments whenever he relieved me in the sick-room, I could tell he was always anxious to satisfy himself that I had not done anything to prejudice the work we had in hand. It may easily be supposed, therefore, that our partnership was far from being as pleasant as it had promised in London to be. To live in an atmosphere of continual suspicion is unpleasant at any time, but it becomes doubly so when another's happiness depends in a very large measure upon it. Of course, the reason was apparent to me. There must have been something more in Nikola's mind than I could fathom, for I think I can assert most truthfully that never for a moment did I allow an effort to be wanting on my part to show how much I had his interest at heart. There was yet another thing which puzzled me. It was this: what was to happen when the required result had been achieved, and the old Don was transformed into a young man again? And more important still, what would become of his great-granddaughter? The whole thing seemed so absurd, so unnatural, if you like it better, that I could see no proper conclusion to it. Still, there was time to talk of that later on. The old Don was already, I am prepared to admit, in a certain sense, younger. That is to say, he did not present that appearance of great age which had been noticeable on board the Dona Mercedes. At the same time, he was still very far from being a young man. One day I found sufficient courage to speak on this point to Nikola. "That is one of the most remarkable points in my argument," he answered. "If he were to change his state so quickly, I should despair of success. As it is, I am more than hopeful. I am sanguine. To-morrow, if he continues to progress so favourably, we shall enter upon the third stage of the experiment. Granted that is successful, I shall be within measurable distance of the greatest medical discovery of this or any other century." Knowing it was useless attempting to question him further, I was compelled to possess my soul in patience until the time should arrive for him to enlighten me. The following morning, as soon as I had finished my period of duty in the Don's chamber, I informed Nikola of my intention of going for a short stroll. The time, he had decided, was not ripe yet for the third phase, as I knew that I should be kept closely employed as soon as it was. I was anxious to obtain as much exercise as possible while I had the opportunity. Accordingly, I placed my hat upon my head and descended into the courtyard. Strangely enough, it was the first time I had set foot in it since our arrival at the castle. It was an exquisite morning for walking. The sky was blue overhead. A brisk breeze was blowing, and when I had crossed the drawbridge and looked down into the little bay where the waves rolled in and broke with a noise like thunder upon the beach, I felt happier than I had been for some considerable time past. I watched the white gulls wheeling above my head, and as I did so the recollection of the time when I had last seen them rose before my mind's eye. It was the day that I had come so near to speaking words of love to Donna Consuelo upon the battlements. I remember the look I had seen in her sweet face, and as I did so I realized how much she was to me. With a light step and a feeling of elation in my heart, I made my way down the path towards the beach. Not a soul was to be seen, for I remembered having heard Nikola say that the yacht had gone south for stores. Reaching the water's edge, I stood and looked back at the castle. It was a sombre enough place in all conscience, and yet there was something about it which affected me in a manner I can scarcely describe. I looked at it for a few moments, then turning my back upon it, I set off along the beach at a brisk pace, whistling gaily as I went. Eventually I reached the further side of the bay opposite that on which the castle was situated. Here the sand gave place to large rocks, which in their turn terminated in a tall headland. The view from these rocks was grand in the extreme. Night and day the rollers of the North Sea broke upon them, throwing showers of spray high into the air. Clambering up, I struggled for 50 yards or so, and finally seating myself upon a rock somewhat larger than the rest, to enjoy the view. A surprise was in store for me. Looking back upon the way I had come, I caught sight of a figure walking towards me on the sands. Needless to say, it was the Donna Consuelo. Whether she was aware of my presence upon the rocks I cannot say. I only know that as soon as I saw her, I rose from where I was sitting and hastened to meet her. How beautiful she looked, and how her face lighted up as I came closer, are things which I must leave to the imagination of my reader. "You are further abroad than usual to-day, are you not?" I said as we shook hands. "Might I not say the same of you?" she answered with a smile. "The morning was so beautiful that I could not remain in that terrible old building. Every corner seems to suggest unhappy memories to me." "Do you really think that all the memories connected with it will be unpleasant?" I inquired. She looked up at me in a little startled way, and blushed divinely as she did so. "Could you expect me to regard the time I have spent in it with any sort of pleasure?" she inquired, fencing with my meaning, and giving me a Roland for an Oliver. "Only think what I have suffered in it." By this time we were strolling back towards the rocks I have already described. The beach at this point narrowed considerably, and for some reason or another we walked a little nearer the cliff than I had done. Suddenly my companion stopped, and pointing to the sand, said, "You had a companion this morning." "I? I had no companion," I answered. "What makes you think so?" "Look here," she said, and as she spoke she pointed to some footmarks in the sand before us. "As you went up the beach you walked near the water's edge, and as you came to meet me you passed midway between your former tracks and the cliff. If you did not have a companion, whose footprints are these?" "They must have been made this morning, for, as you are aware, when the tide is full it comes right up to the cliffs, and would be certain to wash anything out that existed before." I stooped and examined the tracks carefully before I answered. They were evidently those of a man, and from the fact that the sand was hard the outline could be plainly distinguished. The foot that was responsible for them was a large one, and must have been clad in an extremely clumsy boot. "I don't know what to think of it," I said. "One thing, however, is quite certain. I had no companion this morning. What about the old man and his wife at the castle?" "I happen to know they have both been hard at work all morning," she answered. "Besides, what object could they have in following you? The beach leads nowhere, and from here to yonder point there is no place where you can reach the land above." I shook my head. The problem was too much for me. At the same time, I must own, it disquieted me strangely. Who was this mysterious person who had dogged my footsteps? What could have been his object in following me? For a moment I inclined to the belief that it might have been Dr. Nikola, who was anxious to discover how I spent my leisure. But on second thoughts the absurdity of the idea became apparent to me. But if it were not Nikola, who could it have been? On reaching the rocks we seated ourselves and fell to criticising the picture spread before our gaze. There was something in my companion's manner this morning which, analyse it as I would, I could not understand. She was by turns light-hearted and sad. The two expressions chased each other across her face like clouds across an April sky. At last she returned to the topic which I knew must come sooner or later, that of her great-grandfather's condition. "I seem cut off from him for ever," she said with infinite sadness. "I hear nothing of him from week's end to week's end, and I see nothing of him. He has gone completely out of my life." "But only for the time being," I answered. "Dr. Nikola has assured you that he will restore him to health and strength. Think what that will mean, and how happy you will be together then." "I know it's very wrong of me to say so," she continued, "but I cannot keep it back. Dr. Ingleby, I distrust Dr. Nikola. He is deceiving me. Of that I feel sure." Knowing what I did, I could not contradict her, but I saw my opportunity and acted upon it. "But if you do not trust Dr. Nikola," I said, "am I to suppose that you do not trust me?" She was silent, and I noticed that she turned her face away from me, as if she were anxious to study the castle and the cliff. What was more, I noticed that her hand trembled a little as it rested on the rock beside me. Once more I put the question, and as I did so leant a little towards her. "I do trust you," she answered, but so softly I could scarcely hear it. "Consuelo," I said, in a voice but a little louder than that in which she had addressed me, "you cannot think what happiness it is to me to hear you say that. As I have tried to show you, there is nothing I would not do to prove how anxious I am to be worthy of your trust. We have known each other but a little longer than a month. In that time, however, I have learnt to know you as well as any man could know a woman. I have learnt more than that, Consuelo. I have learnt to love you better than life itself." "No, no," she answered, "you must not say that. I cannot hear you." "But it must be said," I answered. "My love will not be denied. You do love me, Consuelo. I can see it in your face. Don't you think that I watched and longed for it?" Instead of turning her face to me, she turned it still further from mine. I took her little hand in mine. "What is your answer, Consuelo?" I asked. "Be brave and tell me, darling." "If I were brave," she said, "I should tell you what you ask must never be. That it is hopeless, impossible. That it would be madness for us to think of such a thing. But I am not brave. I am so lonely in the world, and have lost so much, that I cannot lose you also." "Then you love me!" I cried in such triumph as I had never felt for anything else in my life before. Thank God for that." "Yes, I love you," she answered, and the great waves breaking on the rocks seemed to echo the happiness we were both feeling. Over the next half hour I must draw a veil. By the end of that time it was necessary for me to think of returning to the castle. Nikola's watch would be up in an hour, and I knew it would not do for me to keep him waiting. As I said as much to Consuelo, and we immediately rose and set out on our return. As I walked beside her, I would not have changed position with any living man, so happy was I. My peace of mind, however, was destined to be but short-lived. We had crossed the greater number of the rocks, and were approaching the sand once more, when I received a shock which I shall not forget as long as I can remember anything. Clambering over the sharp and slippery rocks was by no means an easy business. It was, however, delightful to hold my sweetheart's hand in the pretence of assisting her. Occasionally it became necessary for us to make considerable detours, and once I bade her remain where she was until I had climbed a somewhat bigger rock than usual, in order to find out whether we could proceed that way. I had reached the top, and was about to extend my hand to her assistance, when something caused me to look behind me. Judge of my surprise and consternation at finding in the hollow below me a man crouching on the sand watching me. It was the Chinaman I had seen on board the Donna Mercedes, the man who had thrown the knife which had so nearly terminated Nikola's existence. How I managed to retain my presence of mind at that trying moment, I find it difficult now to understand. I only know this, that I realised in a flash the fact that it would have been madness to pretend to have seen him. Accordingly, I stood for a moment looking out to sea. Then, with a laugh that must have sounded far from natural, I rejoined Consuelo on the rock below and chose another path towards the sands. "What is the matter?" she inquired when we had proceeded a short distance. "Your face is quite pale." "I did not feel very well for a moment," I answered, making use of the first excuse that occurred to me. "I am afraid you are not telling me the truth," she answered. "I feel convinced something has frightened you. Can you not trust me?" "Under the circumstances, I thought it would be better for me to make a clean breast of it." "I will trust you," I answered. "The fact of the matter is, I have discovered an explanation for the footsteps you pointed out to me upon the beach. We are being followed. When I jumped on top of that rock, I found a man lying on the other side of it." "A man? Who could he have been? Why should he be spying on us? Did you recognise him?" "Perfectly. I should have known him anywhere. Then who was he?" "The Chinaman we saw on board the steamer, the man who stole the drugs Nikola entrusted to my care." "Do you mean the man who entered my cabin and bent over to look at me?" she cried in alarm. I nodded and threw a quick glance over my shoulder to discover whether we were still being followed. I could see nothing, however, of the man, a circumstance which by no means allayed my anxiety. "What do you think we had better do?" inquired Consuelo. "Hasten home as fast as we can and go tell Nikola," I answered. "It's imperative he should know at once." We accordingly continued our walk at increased speed, every now and then throwing apprehensive glances behind us. It is possible some of my readers may regard it as an exhibition of cowardice on my part to have sought refuge in flight, but when all the circumstances connected with it are taken into consideration, I am sure every fair-minded person would acquit me of this charge. Had I been alone, it is possible I might have turned and risked an encounter with the man, but Consuelo being with me rendered such a course impossible. For the first time since we had known it, the grim old castle, perched up on the cliff, seemed a desirable place, and it was with a feeling of profound relief that I led my sweetheart across the drawbridge and was able to tell myself, for the time being at least, she was safe. On reaching the hall, I found that I still had 20 minutes to spare. I had no desire, however, for further leisure. What I wanted was to see Nikola at once in order to tell him my unpalatable news. On entering the room, I found him engaged in taking the old man's temperature. He looked up at me as if he were surprised to see me return so soon, but said nothing until he had finished the work upon which he was engaged. "I can see from your face that you have had a fright, that you have something to say to me concerning it," he began, when he returned the thermometer to its case. "Our friend Quong Ma has turned up again, I suppose." "How did you know it?" I asked, for I had no idea that he was aware of the man's appearance in the neighbourhood. "I guessed it," he answered with one of his peculiar smiles. "You are the possessor of a most expressive countenance. Consider for a moment, and you will understand how it is I am able to arrive at a conclusion so quickly. In the first place, you have been for a walk with the young lady whom you love and who loves you in return." "Perhaps you saw me," I replied sharply, feeling myself blushing to the roots of my hair. "I have not left this room," he answered. "There is a long black hair on your collar which should not have been there if you had spent your liberty by yourself. The same thing tells me that you love her and she loves you. As for the other matter, the caretaker and his wife have been busily employed in the castle all morning, while Ah Win never leaves its own portion of the premises. There is only one person outside the walls who could have put that expression into your face, and that person is Quong Ma. Am I right?" "Quite right," I replied. "He followed me along the sands and hid himself among the rocks. In recrossing them from the point, I, as nearly as possible, jumped on him." "I am very glad you did not quite do so," he answered. "Had you experienced that misfortune, you would not have been here to tell the tale. But enough of him for the present. Take your place here and watch our patient. In an hour's time his temperature should have risen 2 points. When it has done so, give him 10 drops of this fluid in 20 drops of distilled water. A profuse perspiration should result, which will herald the return of consciousness and the new life. In 24 hours he should not only be conscious, but on his way to the commencement of his second youth. In 48 the improvement should be firmly established, while in a week we should have him on his legs, a living, moving, thinking man, and of my own creation. Watch him, therefore, and whatever happens, do not leave this room. Meanwhile, I'll have the drawbridge raised, and if Quong Ma can leap the chasm and make his way into the castle, well, all I can say is he's a cleverer man than I take him to be." With that, Nikola left me, and I sat down to watch beside the aged Don. Apart from my duty towards him, I had plenty to think about. Over and over again, I found myself recalling the incidents of the morning. Consuelo loved me, and happen what might, I would prove myself worthy of her love. At the end of the hour, as Nikola had predicted, the patient's temperature had risen 2 points. I accordingly measured out the stipulated quantity of the medicine he had placed in readiness for me, added the necessary quantity of water, and poured it into the old man's mouth. Then I sat myself down to wait. Slowly the hands of the clock upon the wall went round, and 60 minutes later, just as Nikola had prophesied, small beads of perspiration made their appearance upon his forehead. It was an exciting moment, and one for which we had been eagerly waiting. I immediately rang the bell for Nikola, and upon his arrival informed him of the fact. At last," he whispered. "It is certain now that I have made no mistake. From this moment forward his progress should be assured. In a week you will be rewarded by a sight such as the eye of man has never yet seen. Be faithful to me, Ingleby. I pledge my word that your future with the woman you love is assured." For the remainder of that day, and indeed until 11 o'clock in the morning the following, there was but little change in the old Don's condition. The casual observer would have seen but little difference from the day on which I had first taken charge of him on board the steamer. To Nikola and myself, however, who had spent so much time with him, and who had noted every change, there was a difference so vast that it seemed almost incomprehensible. My watch the next morning was from 4 o'clock until 8. At 8 I breakfasted, and afterwards repaired to the battlements above in the hope of meeting Consuelo. Since Nikola had ordered the drawbridge to be raised, we had been compelled to make this our meeting place, and as it happened, Consuelo was the first at the rendezvous. "You have good news for me," she cried after I had kissed her. "I can see it in your face. What is it? Does it concern my great-grandfather?" "It does," I answered. "It concerns him inasmuch as I am able to tell you that what Nikola promised you should happen has in reality come to pass. Everything has been satisfactory beyond our wildest hopes." "And do you mean that all need of anxiety is over?" she cried. "I don't mean that exactly," I answered, "but I think it is very possible we shall soon be able to say so. Nikola is certainly the most wonderful man upon this earth." What she said in reply it would be vanity on my part to recall. It would only be another instance of the folly of lovers' talk. Let it suffice that for upwards of an hour our converse was of the sweetest description. Hand in hand we sat upon the battlements, looking out across the sunlit sea, and building our castles in the air. We were interrupted by Ah Win, who suddenly made his appearance before us, and beckoned me to follow him. Bidding Consuelo good-bye, I followed the fellow to the hall, where he pointed to the old Don's room and left me. I found Nikola in a state of wildest excitement. "I sent for you because the crisis is close at hand," he whispered. "At any moment now I may know my fate. Little by little I have built up this worn-out frame, strengthening and renewing, revivifying, and now the object of my ambition is almost achieved. 1,000 years ago the secret was guessed by a certain sect in Asia. After working 100 or more years upon it, they at length perfected it, but by the law of their order only one man was permitted to derive any benefit from it. I obtained their secret, how it does not matter, added to it what I thought it lacked, and here is the result." As he spoke, a visible tremor ran over the form on the bed before us. The excitement was well nigh unbearable. For the first time in more than 30 days movement was to be detected. The eyelids flickered, the mouth twitched, and little by little the eyes opened. Nikola immediately stooped over him and concentrated all his attention upon the pupils. Then, placing his finger-tips so close that they almost touched the lashes, he drew them away again in long transverse passes. "Do you know me?" he asked in a voice that shook with emotion. Almost instantly the man replied, "I know you." "Do you suffer any pain?" "I do not." "Sleep then, rest and gain strength, and in 2 days from this hour wake again a strong man." Once more he placed his hands before the patient's eyes. As he drew them away the lids closed. Nikola bent over him and listened, and when he rose he nodded reassuringly to me. "It's all right," he said. "His respiration is as even and unbroken as that of a sleeping child." As usual, my watch that night was from 8 o'clock until midnight. From the fact that Don Miguel continued to sleep as quietly at that moment as when Nikola had hypnotized him, it was neither as difficult nor as anxious as before. Nor was I altogether discontented with my lot. I was in love. I was loved in my turn. I was engaged in deeply interesting employment, which, should the experiment terminate successfully, would in all probability ensure my being able to start for a second time in my profession, and with an added knowledge that it would bring me to the top of the tree at once. The room in which I sat was warm and comfortable. Outside, however, a violent storm was raging. The rain and wind beat against the window in the hall with the wildest fury. Now, ever since I had watched by the Don's bedside, I had made it my habit to carefully lock the door as soon as Nikola left the room. On this particular occasion I had not departed from my custom. The hands of the clock on the wall stood at 11 minutes, and I was reflecting that I should not be sorry when my watch was over and I at liberty to retire to bed, when, to my astonishment, I saw the handle of the door slowly turn. At first I almost believed that my imagination was playing me a trick, but when the handle revolved and was afterwards turned again, I was satisfied that this was not the case. Who was the person on the other side? It would not be Ah Win, for the reason that he had been particularly instructed on no account ever to touch the door. Consuelo would not venture into that portion of the castle again on any consideration whatsoever, while Nikola himself, being aware that I always kept it locked, would have knocked before attempting to enter. Whoever it was must have been satisfied that the task was a hopeless one. At any rate, he desisted, and I heard no more of him. A few moments later the ventilator required my attention, and I was too busy to bestow any more thought upon the matter. Indeed, it was not until Nikola knocked upon the door and relieved me that it entered my mind again. It became apparent immediately that he attached more importance to the incident than I was inclined to do. "Very strange," he said, "but it accounts for one thing which I must confess has puzzled me." "What is that?" I inquired. "Here, I will show you," he answered, and led the way to the hall. At the further end, near the window, he paused and pointed to a mark upon the floor. Not being able to see it very distinctly, I went down upon my hands and knees. "Do you know what it is?" asked Nikola. "I do," I answered. "It is the print of a naked foot." "Yes," said Nikola, "and that foot was wet. It was more than that." Here he took a magnifying glass from his pocket, and also went down upon his hands and knees. "The chimney leading from Ah Win's room," he said, "is almost exactly above our heads. In consequence, as you may have noticed, the battlements at that point are invariably covered with smuts. The naked foot which made this mark brought some of these particles with it, which tells us that there was only one way in which the owner could have come, and that was down a rope and through the window. Let us examine the window." We did so, but so far as I could see there was nothing there to reward us. The rain was pelting down, and the wind blew as I had never heard it before. "The man, whoever he was certainly not deficient in pluck," said Nikola. "I shouldn't have cared to lower myself over the battlements on a night like this." "Are you sure that he did not lower himself?" I inquired. "I'm quite sure," Nikola answered. "How else could he have come? The old Don is safe for half an hour at least. Get your revolver. I will get mine, and we'll go upstairs in search of the intruder." I did as he directed, but with no great willingness. As you may suppose, I was quite convinced as to the identity of the mysterious visitor, and knowing his proficiency in the art of knife throwing, I had not the smallest desire to become better acquainted with him. However, I was not going to allow Nikola to think I was afraid, so putting the best face I could upon it, I did as he directed. and having assured myself that my weapon was loaded in every chamber, I followed him along the corridor, up the stone staircase, and so out onto the battlements above. Of all the storms in my experience, I think that particular one was certainly the worst. The rain beat in our faces, and so great was the strength of the wind that the very castle itself seemed to shake and tremble before it. Revolver in hand, expecting every moment to be confronted by the man of whom we were in search, I followed Nikola in the direction of the engine-room chimney. I knew very well for what he was looking. He thought he would find a rope there, but in this he was disappointed, nor were we able to discover any traces of human beings. We searched the whole length of the battlements in vain, and at last were perforce compelled to give up the hunt as hopeless. Returning to the stairway once more, we were about to descend when I saw Nikola stoop and pick something up. Whatever it was, he said nothing to me until we had reached the light of the corridor below. Then he held it up for me to see. It was a grey felt hat, the same that I had seen upon the Chinaman's head that morning. "Mark my words," said Nikola, "we shall have trouble with Quong Ma before very long." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Dr. Nicola's Experiment by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. When we had returned to the corridor below the battlements, after our search for the man who had lowered himself down to the window of the hall, Nikola brought with him the soft felt hat I had observed upon the head of that villainous Chinaman Quong Ma that morning. Though neither of us was altogether surprised at finding that he was the man we suspected of being in the castle, we were none the more pleased at having our suspicions confirmed. The thing which puzzled us most, however, was how he had obtained admission, seeing that he had not been in sight when I had entered the castle that morning, that I had informed Nikola of my meeting with him within 5 minutes of my arrival, and that the drawbridge had been raised, if not at once, certainly within a quarter of an hour of making my report. And yet it was plain that he had been upon the battlements, that he was in the castle, and that his being there boded no good was as apparent as his presence. "I always knew they had original ideas," said Nikola, "but I had no idea that they were as clever as this. We shall have to be very careful what we do for the future, for, from what I know of them, they would stick at nothing. Tomorrow morning we must search the castle from dungeon to turret, and if we find them—" "In that case," said Nikola, "I fancy I know a way of dealing with them. Dona Consuelo locks her door at night, I suppose?" I informed him that I had advised her to do so. "It would be better that we should make certain," he answered, and proceeding to the door in question, he softly turned the handle. It was securely fastened from the inside. "Seems all right," said Nikola. "Now we will return to our own quarters and make everything secure there." We did as suggested, and when everything was made fast, to securely lock the door in the corridor behind us. Reaching the hall once more, we made a careful survey of the various rooms, including not only the apartments leading out of it, but also the passage leading to Ah Win's quarters. No sign, however, of the man we wanted was to be seen there. Returning to the hall, we assured ourselves that our patient was still sleeping quietly, and then I bade Nikola good night and prepared to go to my room. "I should advise you to lock your door," he said as we parted. "You cannot take too many precautions when Quong Ma and his companion are about. Shall I require your assistance during the night, I will ring for you." I promised to answer his call immediately, and was about to turn away when it occurred to me to ask him a question to which he had promised me an answer upwards of a month before. "On the night that we left Newcastle," I said, "you were kind enough to say that when a fitting opportunity occurred to you, you would tell me what has induced these men to follow you as they are doing." "There is no reason why you should not hear it," Nikola replied. "To tell it in full, however, would be too long a story, but I will briefly summarize it for you. In order to obtain the information necessary for carrying out the experiment upon which we are now engaged, I penetrated, as I think I have already informed you, into a certain monastery situated in the least known portion of Thibet. My companion and I carried our lives in our hands, if ever men have done so in the history of the world. The better to carry out my scheme, I might explain, I impersonated a high official who had lately been elected one of the rulers of the order. At a most unfortunate moment the fraud was discovered, and my companion and I were ordered to be hurled from the roof of the monastery into the precipice below. We managed to escape, however, but not before I had secured the precious secret for which I had risked so much. The monks traced us on our journey back to civilization, and 2 of the order, who have had special experience in this sort of work, were detailed to follow us in the hope that they might not only regain possession of a book which contained the secret, but at the same time revenge the insult which had been offered to them. "And you still have the book? Would you care to see it?" asked Nikola. I replied that I should like to immensely, whereupon he retired to his own apartment, to presently return, bringing with him a small packet which he placed upon the table. Untying the string which bound it, and removing a sheet of thin leather, he exposed to my gaze a small book, possibly 8 inches long by 4 wide. The materials in which it was bound were almost dropping apart with age. The backs and corners, however, were clamped with rusty iron. The interior was filled with writing in the Sanskrit character, a great deal of which had faded and was barely decipherable. I took it tenderly in my hands. "And it is to regain possession of this book that these men are following you?" I asked. "To do that," he answered, "and to punish me for the trick I played on them. They have not, however, accomplished their task yet, nor shall they do so if I can help it. Let me once get hold of Quong Ma, and he'll do no more mischief for some time to come." As Nikola said this, his great cat, which for the past few moments had been sitting upon his knees, suddenly stood up and placed its 4 paws upon the table, scratched at the cloth. Nikola was watching my face, and what he saw there must have considerably amused him. "You are thinking that Apollyon and I are not unlike. When we get out our claws we are dangerous. It would be well for our Chinese friend if he understood as much. Now you had better be off to bed, and I to my watch." When Nikola relieved me at 8 o'clock the morning following, it was plain that there was something important toward. "Get your breakfast as soon as you can," he said, "and when you have done we will search the castle. You heard nothing suspicious during your watch, I suppose?" "Nothing," I replied. "Everything has gone just as usual." As soon as I had finished my breakfast, Ah Win summoned me, and together we set off on our errand. Beginning with the battlements, we took the castle corridor by corridor, floor by floor, examining every corner and staircase in which it could be possible for a human being to hide himself. Having exhausted the inhabited portion of the building, we searched the rooms into which no one had penetrated from year's end to year's end. These we also drew blank. Then, descending another flight of stairs, we reached the basement, explored the great kitchens, once so busy, and now tenanted only by rats and beetles, and examined the various domestic offices, including the buttery and armoury, still without success. If Quong Ma was in the castle, it looked as if he must certainly possess the power of rendering himself invisible at will. At last we reached the keep, where the old couple, who, as Nikola had said, officiated as caretakers during his absence, had their quarters. At the moment of our arrival the woman was bitterly upbraiding her husband for some misdeed. "I'll tell 'ee," she said, slapping the table with her hand to emphasise her words, "that when I went to bed last night they vitals was in yonder cupboard. What I want 'ee to say is where they be now. Don't 'ee say 'ee never saw them, or that it was the cat as stole them, for 'ee may talk till 'ee be black in the face, and I'll not believe 'ee. Cats don't turn handles and undo latches, and mutton don't walk out of the front door on its own leg. If he be a man, he'll tell the truth, and shame the devil." I must leave you to picture for yourself the vehemence with which all this was said. The words poured from her throat in a torrent, and every sentence was punctuated with slaps upon the table. So engaged were they in their quarrel that some moments elapsed before they perceived Nikola and myself standing in the doorway. When they did, the tumult ceased as if by magic. "You seem to be enjoying yourselves," said Nikola dryly. Perhaps you'll be kind enough to tell me what it's all about." He had no sooner finished than the irate lady recommenced. "It's just this way, my lord," she said, though why she should have bestowed a title upon Nikola I could not understand. "Last night I was troubled with rheumatism, mortal bad. Went to bed early. The old man there, begging your pardon for the liberty I'm taking, was a sitting by the fire, smoking his pipe. Such as being his custom of an evening, he'd had his supper, as I seed with my own eyes. When he'd finished, there was an end leg of mutton in yon cupboard. When it comes this morning, I take it out for breakfast. It's gone, and with it the bread as I baked with my own hands but yesterday. And he stands there, saving your presence, my lord, and wants for I to believe how he's not touched it, and the latch of the cupboard down, as you can see for yourselves, honourable gentlemen both, with your own eyes. I've been married these 43 years, and I don't know as how you'll believe it, my lord." Seeing that she was getting up steam once more, Nikola held his hand up to her to be silent. "What you tell me is very interesting," he said, fixing his dark eyes upon her. "But let me understand you properly. You say you went to bed, leaving your husband smoking his pipe in this room. Before retiring, you convinced yourself that the food which is now not forthcoming was in the cupboard. Is that so?" "Yes, my lord, and honourable gentlemen both." And addressing her husband, Nikola continued, "I suppose you went to sleep over your pipe?" The question had to be repeated, and his wife had to admonish him with, "Speak up to his lordship like a man," before he could answer. Even then his reply was scarcely satisfactory. He thought he might have fallen asleep, but he was not at all sure upon the point. He admitted that he was in the habit of doing so, and as far as Nikola was concerned, this settled the matter. "Quong Ma," he said, turning to me. "Now I understand where he gets his food from." Then turning to the woman, he said, "Your husband is a heavy sleeper, I suppose?" "Why, bless you, sir," she replied, "he sleeps that heavy you can't wake him. As for snoring, why, the rattling of that old bridge out yonder when they're a drawing of it up ain't to be compared with him, as the saying is. I did hear of a man that lived down Sunderland as did snore so that when he woke up, the folks next door sent in to ask him to go on again, the stillness being that lonesome they couldn't bear it." Nikola peremptorily made the old woman to be silent, and ordered her for the future to see that her door was locked at dusk every evening. And addressing her husband, he inquired if the latter was conversant with the subterranean passages of the castle, and when he had replied in the affirmative, bade him light a lantern and show us all he could. The man did so, and having conducted us across the courtyard, entered a long low chamber which might once have been used as a bakehouse. In this was a large wooden door secured with many bolts, but now fallen into considerable disrepair. These bolts he drew one by one with an air of importance that was indescribably comic. "I don't quite understand how these bolts come to be fastened if the man is down below," said Nikola, addressing me. I shook my head, whereupon he bade the old man inform him whether there were any other entrances to the vaults in question. "Lor, sir," the man replied, "the castle be fair mazed with them. If he likes the place, I can take you to most any room in the place from down below." "I should have thought of that," said Nikola, more to himself than to me. "I'm sorry I didn't question our friend here before. Quong Ma had evidently mastered the situation, and is playing a game of hide and seek. However, we'll examine the dungeons first, and the passages afterwards. So lead the way, my friend." The old man going ahead carrying the lantern, Nikola following, and Ah Win and myself bringing up the rear, we made our way down the clammy stone staircase into the subterranean portion of the castle. It was an experience that would have been worth anything to a novelist seeking colour for a historical tale. But knowing what I did about the man we were after, I cannot say that I appreciated the incident so much. In addition to my nervousness, my head was aching, while hot and cold perspirations alternately contributed to my general discomfort. What was the matter with me? I could not think. As it was, I was the only member of the party, I believe, who felt any symptoms of fright. The old man with the lantern knew nothing of his danger. Ah Win was an Asiatic and a fatalist, and in his master's presence appeared not to care whom or what he faced, while as for Nikola himself, I believe most implicitly that cold-blooded individual would have faced certain death as coolly and as contentedly as he would have tossed off a glass of wine. Lower and lower we descended, glancing into dungeons which no light of day had ever penetrated, and stooping to make our way along passages in which the moisture from the roof fell, drip, 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 upon our heads. Search as we would, however, we could discover no trace of that villainous celestial. "We be close down along the sea now, your lordship," said the old man, "and when I tells 'ee that it's summat not many folks as bided in this here castle ever knowed." "Most admirable of men," said Nikola, "you are telling me exactly what I want to know. Do you mean that it is possible for us to reach the sea from where we are now standing without crossing the drawbridge?" "That's exactly what I do mean, my lord," he answered. "And if your lordship and the honourable gentleman will come with I, I'll let you see for yourselves." Forthwith the old fellow, holding his lantern aloft, turned down a narrow passage leading to the right, and a few minutes later brought us up some steps, at the bottom of which the light of day could be plainly seen. To reach the bottom of the steps was a work of a moment, and once there a curious scene was revealed to us. A doorway opened into the chasm which I have described earlier, and was situated almost directly beneath the drawbridge and the keep. Kneeling down, Nikola and I looked over the edge and could plainly see a number of iron steps let into the rock, one above the other. At the bottom, for it was now a full tide, the sea washed and dashed with terrific force. Rising to his feet again, Nikola addressed the old man. "Is it possible at low tide," he said, "to reach the sands from here?" "Lord bless you, sir," the man replied, "when the tide is down he can get along from rock to rock without as much as wetting shoe leather." "That accounts for everything," said Nikola with considerable satisfaction. "I understand exactly how Quong Ma got into the castle now. He must have laughed to himself when he saw that we had raised the drawbridge in the hope of keeping him out. However, forewarned is forearmed, and this place shall be bricked up this morning. You, my old friend, had better see to it, and be sure that you make a good job of it." The old man promised to do so, and seeing that there was nothing further to be gained by remaining where we were, Nikola bade him conduct us back again to our own portion of the building by a secret passage, if possible. The man assured us that we could do so, and was as good as his word. We climbed, crawled, and scrambled away up the narrow steps along a rabbit warren of a small passage behind our guide. At last he stopped. "Would your lordship be kind enough to say where he think ye are now?" he said. "I have not the least notion," said Nikola. "Nor I," added. "Well, sir, I will show 'ee." And the man, after a little hunting, he found and pressed something on the wall. There was a grating noise, as a sound of rusty hinges being slowly unfolded. Then a portion of the wall swung outward, and we found ourselves standing at the top of the great staircase, within a few yards of Consuelo's apartments. "This is uncanny, to say the least of it," remarked Nikola. "Pray, do any of these interesting passages open up into the young lady's room opposite, or into the smaller hall occupied by this gentleman and myself?" "Not now, my lord," the man replied. "Time was when they did, but the old lord didn't take kindly to 'em, and they was bricked up as much as 5 year ago." "I'm glad to hear it," said Nikola, and you may imagine that I echoed the sentiment. Nikola thereupon thanked the old man and dismissed him, at the same time reiterating his order that the opening in the chasm below the drawbridge should be made secure. The excitement of the search for Quong Ma and the damp of the passages had been too much for me, and by the time we reached the hall I could scarcely stand. "Good heavens, Ingleby," said Nikola as I dropped into a chair, "you're looking awfully ill. What's the matter?" "Can't exactly say," I answered. "I fear I must have caught a chill on the battlements last night." "And yet you accompanied me down those damp passages this morning. Was that wise?" "I was not going to let you go alone," I replied. He glanced sharply at me, as if he would read my thoughts. "Well, well, I'll tell you what you must do. You must be off to bed at once. There can be no doubt about that." I tried to protest. I explained my desire to see the end of the experiment, but Nikola was adamant. To bed I must go, willy-nilly, and to bed I accordingly went, but not in my own room off the hall. The apartment further down the corridor, next door to that occupied by Consuelo, was arranged for me, and when I was safely between the blankets, Nikola prescribed for me, and my sweetheart was duly installed as nurse. My indisposition must have been more severe than I had supposed, for before nightfall I was in a high state of fever, and by midnight was delirious. I remember nothing further until I opened my eyes and found Consuelo sitting by my side. "What does this mean?" I inquired, surprised to find her there. "It means that you have been very ill," she answered, "and that I am your nurse, and I am not going to permit you to talk very much." To do this was a feat of which I was incapable, but I was not going to be silent until I had learnt something of what had happened. "How long have I been ill?" I inquired. "More than a week," she answered, and then added, "You naughty boy, you little know what a fright you have given me. But you must not talk any more, or Dr. Nikola will be angry." She poured out some medicine for me, bade me drink it, and then reseated herself beside me. In 5 minutes I was wrapped in a heavy slumber, from which I did not wake for several hours. When I did, I found Dr. Nikola installed as nurse. Consuelo had disappeared. "Well, Ingleby," said Nikola cheerily, as he felt my pulse, "you have had a sharp bout of it, but I'm glad to see we've managed to pull you through. How do you feel in yourself?" "Much better," I answered, "though still a bit shaky." "I don't wonder at it," he said. "Do you feel hungry?" "I feel as if I could eat anything," I answered. "Well, that's a good sign. I'll see that something is sent to you. In the meanwhile, keep as quiet as possible. When I leave you, I'll send your sweetheart to you. She's been a devoted nurse, and between ourselves, I rather fancy you owe your life to her." "God bless her," I answered fervently. "But you call her my sweetheart. What do you mean by that?" "My dear fellow, I know everything. One night the young lady in question was rather concerned about you, and in her agitation she allowed the cat to slip out of the bag. You young people seem to have managed the matter pretty well in the short time you've known each other. Now keep quiet for a few moments while I see if I can find her." He was making for the door when I stopped him. "You have not told me how the Don is," I said. "How does the experiment progress?" His face clouded over. "It has proved successful," he answered, but with a sudden sternness that surprised me. It was for all the world as if he were trying to convince me what he said was correct, although in his own heart he knew it was not so. When he spoke again it was very slowly. "Yes, Ingleby," he said, as if he were weighing every word before he uttered it. "The experiment has proved a success. I have made the Don a young man, but, well, to tell the truth, I've made a mistake in my calculations, a mistake that I cannot explain, and that I can in no way account for." "And the result?" "Don't ask me," he said, "for I'm afraid I do not know myself. By the time you are on your feet again I shall hope to have come nearer an understanding of the situation. Then I shall be able to tell you more of what I hope and fear. At present I scarcely like to think of it myself." To my surprise, as I watched him, I saw great beads of perspiration start out upon his forehead, and for the first time since I had known him I saw a look of terror in Dr. Nikola's face. I tried to question him further upon the subject, but he bade me wait until I was stronger, and presently repeating that he would find Consuelo, he left me. When my sweetheart entered the room, looking more beautiful than I had ever seen her, I forgot for the time being about Nikola. "You are looking much better," she said, as she came toward me and put down upon the table the tray she carried in her hand. "Here is some beef tea which I have made for you myself. If you don't drink it all up, I shall let the old woman in the kitchen make it for you in the future, and bring it to you herself." "You'd better not," I answered. "In that case I should refuse to touch a drop of it, and should die of slow starvation in consequence." With a gentleness that was infinitely becoming to her, she lifted my head and held the cup while I drank. If I took longer over it than I should have done at any other time, the fact must of course be attributed to my weakness. "Dr. Nikola says he is very pleased with the progress you have made," she said, when she had replaced the cup upon the table. "But you are to be kept very quiet for some days, and to sleep as much as possible." "And when am I to get up?" I asked. "Get up!" she cried in mock horror. "You must not even think of such a thing for a week at least." "A week!" I replied. "Do you think I have to stay here for a week?" "So Dr. Nikola says." The remainder of our conversation is too sacred to be set down in cold drawn type. Let it suffice that when I fell asleep again it was with her hand in mine. I was more in love even than I had been before. As Consuelo had predicted, more than a week had elapsed before I was permitted to leave my room. Even then I was not allowed to return to my duties at once, but spent the greater portion of my time with Consuelo on the battlements, gaining strength with every breath of sea air that I inhaled. Nikola I saw but little of. He examined me every morning, and on one or two occasions honoured us with his company for a brief period on the castle roof. At the best of times, however, he was not a good companion. He was invariably absorbed in his own thoughts,
spoke but a little, and struck me as being very anxious to say good-bye almost as soon as he arrived. Since then I have learned the true reason of it all, and I have been able to see that complex character in a new light. It never struck me how lonely the man's life must be. During the whole time that I was associated with him, I never once heard him speak of kith or kin. Friends he appeared to have none, while his acquaintances numbered only such men as were necessary to the particular work he happened to be engaged in at the moment of their meeting. His very attainments, his peculiar knowledge of the world, of its under and mystic side, were sufficient to make him hold aloof from his fellow men. In all matters of comfort, a rigid ascetic, the good things of life had no temptation for him. To sum it all up, of this I feel certain, so certain that at times it becomes almost a pain that Nikola, with all his sternness, his self-denial, his genius, and his failings, hungered for one thing, and that was to be loved. Why should I say this, considering that the only evidence I have to offer tends to lead one's thoughts in a contrary direction? I do not know, but as I remarked just now, I feel convinced that my hypothesis is a correct one, as I am that I love Consuelo. But to return to my story, it was not until nearly a fortnight had elapsed since my return to consciousness that I was permitted to take up my duties again. When I did, I returned to my old quarters leading out of the hall, and I think Nikola was pleased once more to have my cooperation. At any rate, he led me to suppose that he was. "When you think that you are up to the mark, I shall be pleased to show you the Don," he said, "and to hear your opinion of him." I expressed myself as being quite equal to seeing him at once. "Very good," he answered, "but I warn you to be prepared for a great and somewhat unpleasant change in the man." So saying, he led me across the hall towards the room in which I had before my illness spent so many hours. Inserting the key in the lock, he turned it, and we entered. I had expected to find it exactly as I had last seen it. A surprise, however, was in store for me. The bed placed in the centre was gone, as were both the electrical appliances. The clock and the thermometers had been removed, the only things that still remained being the electric lights which suspended from the ceiling, and the enclosed fixtures for regulating the supply of hot and cold air. In point of fact, it was a bare room, as well as could be imagined. "Don Miguel," said Nikola, "I have brought an old friend to see you." I looked about the room, but for a moment could see nothing of the old man in question. Then my eye lighted upon what looked like a heap of clothes huddled up on the mattress in the corner. On hearing Nikola's voice, the face looked up at me, a face so terrible, so demoniacal, that I might say that I involuntarily shrank from it. What there was about it that caused me such revulsion I cannot say. It was the countenance of a young man, if you can imagine a man endowed with perpetual youth, and with that youth the cunning, the cruelty, and the vice of countless centuries. "Steady, my friend," I heard Nikola say, and as he did so he placed his hand upon my arm. "Remember, Ingleby, this is nothing more than an experiment." Then, addressing the crouching figure, he bade him stand up. With a snarl like that of a dog, or rather a wild beast, who is compelled to do a thing very much against his will, the man obeyed. I was able then to take better stock of him. Accustomed as I was to the old Don's face, I found it difficult to realize that the healthy, vigorous man standing before me was he, and yet I had only to look at him carefully to have all the doubt upon the subject removed. He was the same, and yet not the same. At any rate, he was an illustration of the marvellous, nay, the almost unbelievable success of Nikola's experiment. "You remember the Don as he was, and you can see to what I have been able to bring him," said Nikola sadly, and for the one moment without a trace of triumph. This, however, was soon forthcoming. "Out of an old man tottering on the brink of the grave, I have manufactured a young and vigorous creature, such as you now see before you. I have made him. I have transformed him. I have subjected nature to science. I have revolutionized the world, abolished death, and upset the teachings and essential ideas of all religions. I have proved that old age can be prevented, and that the grave defied. And I have failed." Under the intensity of his emotion his voice broke, and something very like a sob burst from him. Never since had I known Nikola had I seen him as he was then. To all appearances he was well nigh broken-hearted. "If you have done all this," I asked, "how can you say that you have failed?" "Are you so blind that you cannot see?" he answered. "Examine the man for yourself, and you'll find that he is a human being in animal life only. I've given him back his youth, his strength, his enjoyment in living, but I cannot give him back his mind. In his body I have triumphed, in his brain I have completely failed." "But can it not be set right?" I inquired. "Is the case quite hopeless?" "Nothing is hopeless," he answered, "but it will take years, centuries perhaps, at work to find the secret. I thought when I built up the body I should be building up the brain as well. It was not so. In proportion as his body renewed its youth, his brain shrunk. Let me give you an illustration." He went forwards towards the man, who was now once more crouching upon the floor, watching us over his right shoulder, as if he were afraid we were going to do him harm. "Well, Miguel," said Nikola, patting him upon the head, and speaking to him in the same tone he would have used to a favourite monkey, "how is it with you to-day?" The man, however, took no notice, but bending down played with the lace of Nikola's shoe, now and again looking swiftly up into his face as if he dreaded a blow, and as swiftly looking away again. "This should prove to you what I mean," said Nikola, addressing me. "In his present condition he is less than a man, and yet where would you find a finer frame? His heart, his lungs, his constitution are all perfect." While he had been speaking he had turned his back upon the beast upon the floor, and as he uttered the last words he moved towards me. He had not taken a step, however, before the Don was half off his feet. From childish idiocy his expression had changed until it was a fiendish malignity that surpasses all description in words. In another moment he would have thrown himself on Nikola. As it was, he glared at him until he turned, when in an instant the wild expression was gone, and he was crouching upon the floor once more, picking at his fingers and smiling to himself. "You can see for yourself what he is," said Nikola. "An imbecile. But for one ray of hope I should despair of him." "There is, then, a ray of hope?" I said eagerly, clutching him like a drowning man at a straw. He held out. "Thank God for that." "There is a ray," he answered, "but it is a very little one. I'll give you an example." Turning to the wretched creature on the floor, he extended his hands towards him, and gradually lifting it, bade him rise. The effect was instantaneous. The man rose little by little until he stood upright. Once more pointing his hand directly at him, Nikola moved towards him until the points of his fingers were scarcely an inch from the other's eyes, and slowly raising his fingers he made an upward and downward pass. The eyes closed, and the man still remained rigid against the wall. Turning to me, Nikola said, "You can see for yourself that he is absolutely under my influence and control." I approached and made a careful examination. There could be no doubt about his condition. It was one of the hypnotic coma, and on raising one of the eyelids I found the ball turned upwards and wandering in its orbit. "You are satisfied?" inquired Nikola. "Perfectly," I answered. "In that case let us proceed." "To whom am I speaking?" asked Nikola, addressing the man before him. "To Miguel de Moreno," was the answer, given in a perfectly clear and strong voice, and without apparent hesitation. "Do you know where you are?" "I am with Dr. Nikola." "Before you came to me, with whom and where did you live?" "I live with my great-granddaughter in Cadiz." "Have you any recollection of coming to England?" "I remember it perfectly." "Now lie down upon that mattress and sleep without waking till 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." The man did as he was ordered without hesitation. Nikola covered him with the blankets, and as soon as we had made sure of his safety we left the room, carefully locking the door after us. You can have no idea, Ingleby, what a disappointment this has been to me. 3 times before I have tried and failed, but this time I made sure I had success within my grasp. I have progressed further now than I have ever done before, it is true, but it is the brain that has beaten me. As long as I live I will persevere, and the perfect man who shall retain his youth through all ages shall eventually walk the earth. Now, good night." He held out his hand to me. As I shook it, Apollyon came up and rubbed him against my leg, as if to show that he too appreciated my sympathy. It struck me that I had heard nothing of our friend Quong Ma since we had searched the subterranean portion of the castle for him. I asked Nikola if he had anything to tell me concerning him. "Nothing," he answered, "saving that last night I felt certain that I saw a man across the courtyard. It was just before midnight, The moon was about the building, and I am ready to stake anything that I'm not deceived." "But who could it have been? That's exactly what I want to know," he answered. "You were safe in bed and asleep. It was not the caretaker, for I tried his door and found it locked, and from the sound that greeted me I had good proof it was not he." "But might it not have been Ah Win?" I asked. "I thought so. Before going in search of the figure I hastened to his room, only to find him asleep." "In that case it must have been Quong Ma. But how does the fellow live, and why does he not strike?" "Because he has not yet found his opportunity. When he does, you may be sure he will avail himself of it. And once more, good night. You need not trouble about our patient. I shall take a look at him about midnight." "Good night," I said, and went to my room, the door of which I carefully locked. My last waking thoughts were of Consuelo, and my speculation as to what her feelings would be when she realized the terrible change that had taken place in her great-grandfather was sufficient to give me a nightmare. Over and over again I was afflicted with the most horrible dreams, and when I was roused by a loud thumping on my door and Nikola's voice calling for admittance, it seemed so much part and parcel of the horror that my brain had just pictured for me that for a moment I took no notice of it. It sounded again, so springing from my bed I ran to the door and opened it. "What's the matter?" I asked when he was standing before me. His usual pale face was now ghastly in its whiteness. "Good heavens, man!" he cried. "You have no notion what has happened. Dress yourself immediately and come with me." He sat upon my bed while I huddled my clothes on, and then when I was ready he seized me by the wrist and half dragged me, half led me into the hall. Once there, he pointed to the figure of a man stretched out before the door. It was Ah Win, and his throat was cut from ear to ear. The sight was so sudden and so totally unexpected, it was almost too much for me. Recovering my presence of mind, however, I knelt down and examined him. "Look at his hands," said Nikola. "They are cut to the bone with some sharp-bladed instrument. The murderer must have come here in search of me. Ah Win must have met him, tried to prevent him reaching the door, and was unable to warn us, and so have met his fate." We were both too much overcome to continue the discussion. Quong Ma had struck at last. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Dr. Nicola's Experiment by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. At the conclusion of the preceding chapter, I described to you the terrible discovery we had made of the death of Ah Win. That he had met his fate in an endeavour to prevent Quong Ma from reaching his master's room seemed quite in accordance with the evidence before us. Small wonder was it, therefore, that Nikola was affected. But even in his grief he proved himself unlike the average man. Another man would have bewailed his loss, or at least have expressed some sorrow at his servant's unhappy lot. Nikola, however, did neither, and yet his grief was as plain to the eye as if he had wept copious tears. Having satisfied himself that the poor fellow was really dead, he bade me help him carry the body down the passage to an empty room which adjoined his former quarters. We laid it upon a bed there, and Nikola followed me into the passage, carefully locking the door behind him. When we were back in the hall once more, Nikola spoke. "This has gone far enough," he said. "Come what may, we must find Quong Ma. The fellow must be in the castle at this minute." "Shall we organize a search for him?" I said. "The man must be captured at any hazard. We are risking valuable lives by allowing him to remain at large." Though I use the plural, I must confess I was thinking more of my darling than of anybody else. How did I know that? How did I know that when Quong Ma found that it was impossible for him to get hold of Nikola, he would not revenge himself upon Consuelo? "That we must find him goes without saying," Nikola replied. "I doubt very much, however, if it would be prudent for you to take part in the search. In the first place, you are still as weak as a baby, and in the second, the damp of the subterranean passages might very easily bring on a return of the fever." "You surely do not imagine that I should permit you to go alone?" I said. Nikola gave a short laugh. "I do not want to appear boastful," he said, but I am very much afraid you do not know me yet, my dear Ingleby. However, I will confess that if you really do desire it, and feel equal to the exertion, I shall be very glad of your company. When do you propose to start? At once, he answered. I shall not know a minute's peace until I have revenged our Win. And supposing we catch the fellow, what do you propose to do with him? It's a long way from here to the nearest police station. I don't fancy somehow I shall trouble the police, he said. But we will talk of what we will do with him when we have got him. Now, if you are ready, come along. Thereupon, for the second time, we searched the castle for Quong Ma. And as before, we first visited the battlements and the rooms on the next floor. The basement offices followed, and still being unsuccessful, we unbolted the door leading to the dungeons and entered the subterranean portion of the building. Cool as I endeavoured to appear, I am prepared to confess that when the icy wind came up to greet us from those dark and dreary passages, I was far from feeling comfortable. I don't set up to be a braver man than my fellows, but it seemed to me to require more pluck to enter those dismal regions and to take part in a forlorn hope. With our revolvers in our hands, and Nikola holding the lantern above his head, we explored passage after passage, dungeon after dungeon. Rats scuttled away beneath our feet, bats flew in the darkness above our heads, but as before, not a sign of Quong Ma. "I can't understand it," said Nikola at last, and his voice echoed along the rocky passages. "We have explored every room in the castle, and every dungeon underneath it, and not a trace of the man can we discover. We have bricked up the opening into the chasm, and lifted the drawbridge that connects us with the outside world, and yet we cannot catch him. He must be here somewhere." "Exactly, but where?" "If I knew, do you think I should be standing here?" Nikola replied sharply. "But let us try back again. I want to explore that secret passage the old man showed us the other day. I remember now that there was something that struck me as being rather peculiar about it." We accordingly retraced our steps, found the passage in question, and ascended it. Reaching the point where on the previous occasion we had turned off to find the trapdoor opening at the head on the great staircase, we found, as Nikola had supposed, a second and smaller turning, halfway hidden in a shadow, and which bore away to the right, that is to say, in the direction of the keep. Unfortunately, it was now level going, but so narrow was the passage that it was still impossible to walk two abreast. "Hark, what was that?" Nikola suddenly cried, stopping and holding the lantern above his head. We stopped and listened, and sure enough, a shuffling noise came from the passage in front. A moment later the same sound we had heard when the old caretaker had opened the secret door reached us. "If I am not mistaken, we have found his lair at last," my companion shouted, and ran forward. But certain as we felt that it was Quong Ma we had heard, we were too late to convince ourselves of the fact. The secret door still open. The man, however, was not to be seen in the passage outside. "Where are we?" I asked, for I was not familiar with the corridor in which we had found ourselves. "Between the keep and Ah Win's quarters," Nikola replied. "Now I understand how that fiend has found his way into the hall. But let me think for a moment. There is the gate between us and the hall, and I have the key in my pocket. There is no other exit in either direction. So it seems to me that we have got our man at last. Is your revolver ready?" "Quite ready," I replied. "Come along then. But remember this. If he attacks you, show him no mercy. He'll show you none. Remember our Win." With that we made our way along the corridor in the direction of the room where Nikola's, where the murdered man had been quartered. Nikola unlocked the door and looked in, while I remained in the passage outside. I really believe I was more afraid of what I should see in there than of Quong Ma himself. "He's not there," said Nikola when he rejoined me, and then went to the gate and tested it. "And he can't get out here. We've missed him somewhere, and must look back again." We accordingly retraced our steps, examining room by room, and preparing ourselves every time, lest, when we turned the handle, Quong Ma should jump out upon us. But in every case we were disappointed. "I was surprised just now," said Nikola, after we had left the last apartment and stood in the corridor once more. "But I am doubly so now. He seems to vanish into thin air every time we get near him. There must be another secret passage hereabout, of which we are ignorant. Before we return, however, I want to make quite certain of one thing.
Let us continue that passage by which we ascended from the dungeons just now." We did so, Nikola once more going ahead with the lantern. "Just as I thought," he cried. "Look here." He stooped and stood with his back to the wall. At this point the passage came to an abrupt termination, and on the floor before us was an old blanket, a quantity of straw, about a loaf and a half of bread, and an earthenware pipkin containing a quart or so of water. Under the blanket was a half-used packet of candles, and from the grease that bespattered everything, it was easy to see how he had obtained his illumination. "Well, we have found our bird's nest at last," said Nikola, "but I'm afraid we have driven him away from it for good and all. But we will have him yet, or my name's not Nikola. Now let us go back to the hall. We can do no good by staying here." We returned, but not before we had taken possession of the things we had found, and carefully marked the position of the secret door in case we should want to use it again. "After breakfast we will have another try," said Nikola. "In the meantime we had better take a little rest. You look as if you stood in need of it." It would have been better for me had I abandoned any thought of such a thing, for with Ah Win lying dead only a few yards away, and Quong Ma still at large, the drowsy god was difficult, if not impossible, to woo. Every danger that it would be possible for a man to imagine I pictured for Consuelo, and when at last I did fall asleep, the dreams that harassed me were of the most horrible description. Right glad was I when morning broke and it became necessary to attend to the duties of the day. "If I were you, I should say nothing to your sweetheart, either of her great-grandfather's condition or of the tragedy of last night," said Nikola. I agreed with him, although I knew that it could not be very long before the former would become known to Consuelo. "But surely she will hear about Ah Win before very long," I said. "Will it not be necessary for you to communicate with the county police, and for an inquest to be held?" "Ingleby," replied Nikola, "ask me no questions. I have no desire to draw you into the matter. It is sufficient for you to know that Ah Win is dead." He paused for a minute, and added significantly, "and buried." Try how I would, I could not contain my surprise. How, when, and by whom had the poor Chinaman been buried? Had Nikola carried it out himself? It seemed impossible, yet knowing as I did the indomitable energy and working powers of the man, I felt it might very well be true. I would have questioned him further, but I could see that he was not in the humour to permit it. For this reason I held my peace, though I knew full well at the time that by doing so I was giving my consent to what was undoubtedly an illegal act. From what I have said, I fancy it would be readily agreed that the past 2 or 3 days had been as full of incident as the greatest craver after excitement could desire. I had recovered from a serious illness. I had witnessed the result of one of the most extraordinary experiments the world had seen. Ah Win had been murdered, and we had discovered Quong Ma's hiding place in the castle, and had had a most exciting chase after him. Now Ah Win had been buried secretly by Nikola, and if what had been done was discovered by the authorities, there is no saying in what sort of trouble we might not find ourselves. As soon as we had seen the Don, who was still wrapped in the same hypnotic slumber, and had breakfasted, we organised another search, only to meet with the same result. Later I spent an hour with Consuelo upon the battlements. I was careful, however, to tell her nothing of the death of Ah Win, nor of the reappearance of the detestable Chinaman in the castle. It would have served no good purpose, and would have only frightened her needlessly. When she reiterated her desire to see her grandfather, I found myself, if possible, at still greater disadvantage. On returning to Nikola in the hall, I placed the matter before him. To my surprise, he did not receive it in the same spirit as I expected he would do. I had anticipated a direct refusal, but he gave me nothing of the kind. "Why should she not see him?" he said. "Provided she gave me proper notice, I fancy I can arrange that he shall behave in every way as she would wish him to do." "When, then, may the interview take place?" "Let us say at midday. Will that suit you? But before we arrange anything definitely, let us examine him ourselves and see how he is likely to conduct himself." We accordingly made our way to the patient's room. I had noticed by the hall clock that it wanted only 3 minutes of the hour at which Nikola had ordered the Don to wake. On approaching his bed place, we found him still sleeping peacefully in exactly the same position as when we had seen him last. With his eyes closed and one strong arm thrown out upon the floor, he looked a magnificent specimen of a man. If only Dr. Nikola could perfect the brain, here was a being seemingly capable of anything. But would he be able to do so? That was the question. Watch in hand, Nikola knelt down beside the bed, and for some time not a sound broke the stillness of the room. Punctually, however, as the long hand of the clock pointed to the hour, the Don gave a long sigh. I jumped to the conclusion that he was about to wake in obedience to Nikola's command, but to our surprise he did not do so. Strange, I heard Nikola mutter to himself. Stooping over the patient, he lifted up the eyelids and carefully examined the pupils. 5 minutes went by, and still he did not wake. Don Miguel, said Nikola at last. Don Miguel, Nikola said at last, I command you to wake. You cannot disobey me. A slight movement was visible, but still the sleeper did not comply with the order given him. It was not until a quarter of an hour had elapsed that the consciousness returned to him. With the opening of his eyes, the animal look which I had noticed on the previous day came back to him. Instead of rising to his feet as he was ordered, he crouched and cowered in the corner, pulling at his bedclothes and watching us the while as if he would do us mischief on the slightest provocation. Dangerous as he appeared the day before, it struck me that he was even more so today. It's very plain that we shall have to keep an eye on you, my friend, said Nikola. I'm not quite certain you're going to be docile much longer. Let me feel your pulse. He stooped and was about to take hold of the other's wrist when the man sprang forward and, seizing the doctor with both hands, laid hold of his arm with his teeth just below the elbow. Fortunately, Nikola was wearing a thick velvet coat, otherwise the injury might have been a severe one. Seeing what had happened, I threw myself upon the man and, tearing him off, forced him down upon his bed. He struggled in my grasp, snapping at me and foaming at the mouth like a mad dog, but I had him too secure, and did not let go my hold until Nikola had fixed his arms behind him. Good heavens, Nikola, I cried, scarcely able to contain my emotion. This is too terrible. What on earth are we going to do with him? I do not quite see what we can do, Nikola replied, wiping the perspiration from his forehead as he spoke. However, I must try my hand on him once more. If you can manage to keep him still, and I can get him under my influence, we ought to be able to keep him quiet while we have time to think. I did as requested, while Nikola made slow mesmeric passes before the man's eyes. It was fully 10 minutes, however, before he succeeded, but as soon as he did, the patient's heart-rending struggles ceased, and he lay down upon his bed, sleeping quietly. I began to be afraid I was losing my influence over him, said Nikola as he rose to his feet. One thing is quite certain, I answered, and that is Consuelo must not see him while he is in this state. It would frighten her to death. And she would never forgive me, said Nikola, and I thought I detected a note of sadness in his voice. Are you going to leave him as he is? I inquired. For the present, Nikola answered. I must make up something that will have a soothing effect upon him. You need have no fear. He will be quite safe where he is. The words were scarcely out of his mouth before movement on the bed caused us to look round. Little as we had anticipated such a thing, Nikola's influence was slowly but surely working off, and the man was returning to his old state again. Even now, I never like to think of what happened during the next 10 minutes. Before we could reach him, the Don was on his feet and had rushed upon me. Nikola ran to my assistance, and strong men as we both were, I assure you that at first we could not cope with him. The struggle was a terrific one. He fought like the madman he certainly was, and with an animal ferocity that rendered him doubly difficult to deal with. When at last we did manage to force him back upon his bed and make him secure, we were both completely exhausted. We could only lean against the wall and pant. Conversation was out of the question. This will never do, said Nikola, when he had sufficiently recovered to speak. If this sort of thing goes on, he will murder someone. How are you going to prevent it? I asked. It's plain that your influence has lost its effect. There's nothing for it but to administer an opiate, he answered. Do you think you can manage to hold him while I procure one? I fancied I could. At any rate, I expressed myself as very willing to try. Nikola immediately hurried away. He informed me afterwards that he was not gone more than a minute, but had I been asked, I should have put the time down at least quarter of an hour. To describe to you my feelings during that wait would be impossible. The loathing, the horror, the abject personal fear of the man writhing below me seemed to fill my whole being. "I don't think we shall have much more trouble with him for an hour or two to come," said Nikola, when the drug had taken effect, and we were on our feet once more. "But we cannot go on administering drugs for ever," I answered. "What do you propose to do later on?" "That is what we've got to find out," he replied. "In the meantime we must keep him up like this and take turns to watch him. You had better go out now and get a breath of fresh air. If you see your sweetheart, pacify her with the best excuse you can think of." "Are you sure you are quite safe with him?" I asked. "I must risk it," he replied. But as I moved towards the door he stopped me. "Ingleby," he said, speaking slowly and sadly, "I don't know whether you will believe me or not when I say how deeply I regret what has happened in this case. I would have given anything, my own life even, that things should not have fallen out in this way. And what is more, I do not say this for my own sake." "You're thinking of Consuelo," I said. "I am," he answered. "It is for her sake I feel this regret. As a rule, I am not given to sentiment, but somehow this seems altogether different. But there, go away and tell her what you think best." I left him and went in search of Consuelo. She was in her usual place in the tower above her room. When she saw me, she ran to greet me with outstretched hands. Something, it might have been my pale face, frightened her. "My darling," I said, "you're not ill, are you? What makes you look so alarmed?" "I've been frightened," she answered, "more frightened than I can tell you. For a moment I thought she must have heard about her grandfather, but such was not the case." "I've only been up here a few moments," she answered. "The caretaker's wife was in my room when I left. The door was open, and as I climbed the turret stairs I thought I heard her call me. Turning round, I was about to descend again when I saw standing at the foot of the stairs a man. He was looking up at me. For a moment I could scarcely believe my eyes. Who do you think it was?" Though I could easily guess, I forced myself to utter the word "Who?" "He was the man you saw behind the rock, the same I saw bending over in my cabin aboard the Donna Mercedes, that terrible Chinaman with half an ear." I feared she might see from my face that I knew more than I cared to tell, but as good fortune had it, she failed to notice it. "Surely you must have been mistaken," I answered. "What could the man be doing in the castle?" "I do not know," she answered, "but I am certain that I saw him, as I am of anything. He was standing at the foot of the stairs watching me. Then he began to move in my direction, but before he could reach the bottom step I heard the door open along the corridor. This must have frightened him, for he fled round the corner, and I saw no more of him." "It must have been my opening the door that saved you," I said. "Thank God I came when I did." "But what does it mean?" she asked. "Why did that man come aboard the boat, and why has he followed us here?" "I think the reason is to be found in the fact that he is Dr. Nikola's enemy," I replied. "They had a private quarrel in China some years ago, and ever since then this man has been following him about the world, endeavouring to do him harm. The case is a serious one, darling, and as you love me you must run no risks. Be on your guard night and day. See that your door is locked at night, and never venture from your room after dusk unless I am with you. It makes my blood run cold when I think of your running such risks as you did this morning." "What about you?" she said, looking up at me with her beautiful frightened eyes. "Oh, why cannot we take my grandfather and go away and never see this dreadful place again?" "We must wait patiently," I answered. "The Don is not fit to travel just yet." She gave a little sigh, and the next moment it was time for me to leave her. For the next 2 or 3 days following, Nikola and I took it in turns to act as sentry over the Don. It was not difficult work. It was the reverse of pleasant. For as soon as the effect of each successive opiate wore off, his evil nature invariably reasserted itself. Sometimes he would sit for an hour or more watching me, as if he intended springing upon me the instant I was off my guard. And others he would crouch in a corner, tearing into atoms everything within his reach. More than once he was really violent, and it became necessary for me to signal to Nikola for assistance. The horror of those days I shall never forget. When I say that, not once but several times I have left that room dripping with perspiration and the pure sweat of terror. My feelings may be partially imagined. It was not madness we had to contend with, it was worse than that. It was the fighting of a lost soul against the effect of a man's impious prying into what should have been the realms of the unknowable. "This sort of thing cannot last much longer," said Nikola, when our patient was lying drugged and helpless upon his mattress on the 3rd night after the death of Ah Win. And I knew he was right. Outraged nature would avenge herself. When Nikola had bade me good night, I examined the Don to make sure that he was not shamming sleep, in order to try and get the better of me directly I was alone. Finding him to be quite helpless, I seated myself in my chair and prepared to spend my watch in as comfortable a fashion as possible under the circumstances. During the day I had passed a considerable portion of my time with my sweetheart in the open air, and in consequence I found myself growing exceedingly sleepy. Knowing it would never do to allow slumber to get the better of me in that room, I rose from my chair and began to pace the floor. This had the effect of temporarily rousing me, and when I reseated myself I thought I had dispelled the attack. It soon returned, however, and this time it would not be denied. I rubbed my eyes, pinched myself, got up and walked about. It was no good, however. I returned to my chair, my eyelids closed, and almost without knowing it I dozed off. When I woke again it was with a start. I rubbed my eyes and looked about me. Heavens, what mischief had I done? The Don was not in his corner. The key was gone from the hook upon which it usually hung, and worse than all, the door stood open. For a moment I was so overwhelmed with horror that I could do nothing, but only for a moment. Then I knew that I must act, and at once. I rang the bell for Nikola, and having done so, dashed into the hall. Almost simultaneously Nikola made his appearance, coming from his room. "What's the matter?" he cried. "Why do you ring for me?" "The Don has escaped," I almost shouted. Like the fool I am, I fell asleep, and during that time he must have recovered his wits, stolen the key, and escaped from the room. Oh, what have I done? If she should see him as he is, it will kill her." For a moment it looked as if Nikola would have swept me off the face of the earth, but the look scarcely came into his eyes before it was gone again. "We must find him," he cried, "before he can do any mischief, and what is more, we must not separate, for he would be more than a match for us single-handed." Accordingly we left the hall and proceeded towards the Dona Consuelo's apartments. I thanked heaven when I found that the door was locked. Calling to her in answer to her cry of "Who's there?" I told her that I only desired to assure myself of her safety, and after that we passed on up the turret stairs and along the battlements, but no sign of the Don could we discover there. Returning to the corridor again, we descended to the great entrance hall and searched the courtyard and basement. The rooms shone clear, and the courtyard was as light as day. Had there been any one there, we must certainly have seen him. Suddenly there rang out the most unearthly scream it has ever been my ill luck to hear. It came from the direction of the chapel, which lay between the keep and what had once been the banqueting hall. From where we stood, the interior of the latter was quite visible to us. On either side it had tall windows, so that the light shone directly through. The scream had scarcely died away before we saw a short figure dash into the room and out again upon the other side. An instant later a taller figure followed and also disappeared. Again and again the scream rang out, while Nikola stood rooted to the spot, unable to move hand or foot. "I see it all," cried Nikola. "That was Quong Ma, and the other was the Don. They'll kill each other if they meet." I thought of Consuelo, and thought of the terror she would feel should she hear that dreadful noise. "They must not meet," I cried. "It is too terrible. At any cost we must prevent it. Where do you think they are now?" As if to let us know, another scream rang out. This time it came from our own quarters. "Come on," said Nikola, and dashed into the building. As you may suppose, I followed close upon his heels. In this order we flew up the stairs and along the first gallery, intending, if possible, to reach the small hall by which the staircase near the kitchen in which Ah Win had worked was approached, and thus cut them off. As we crossed the threshold, however, a wild hubbub came from the passage ahead, and told us that we were too late. I knew what it meant, and if I had not been by that time quite bankrupt of emotions, I should certainly have been doubly terrified now. Leaving the kitchen, we dashed along the passage, only to find that the room usually occupied by Nikola's unfortunates was empty, with the exception of one solitary specimen, who by reason of his infirmity was unable to fly. They had all vanished. Leaving him to his own desires, we passed the iron gate, now thrown open, and a moment later had entered the hall itself. Once more the cry sounded, this time coming from a spot somewhat nearer Consuelo's apartment. On hearing it my heart seemed to stand still. What if she should imagine that I was in danger and should open her door? The same thought must have been in Nikola's mind, for I heard him say to himself, anything but that. Side by side we raced for her door, only to find it was still shut and locked. Almost at the same time, a scream, louder than any we had heard yet, sounded from the battlements above. At last, I cried, and led the way up the stone stairs. I can only say that of all the horrid scenes I have ever witnessed, what I saw before me then was the very worst. In the centre of the open space between the parapets, fighting like wild beasts, were the two men of whom we were in search. Their arms were twined about each other, and as they swayed to and fro, the sound of their heavy breathing could be distinctly heard. Having reached the top of the stairs, we paused irresolute. What was to be done? To have attempted to separate them would have only been to draw their anger upon ourselves, and to have made the fight a general one. The moon shone down upon us, revealing the smooth sea on one side and the many turrets of the castle on the other. From fighting in the centre of the open space, they had gradually come nearer to the parapet of the wall. Quong Ma must then have realised how near he stood to death, for he redoubled his energy. "They will be over," shouted Nikola, and started to run towards them. He had scarcely spoken before they reached the edge. For a moment, locked in each other's arms, they paused upon the brink. Then, with a wild shriek from Quong Ma, they lost their balance and disappeared. I clapped my hands to my eyes to shut out the fearful sight. When I took them away again, all was over. Both Nikola and I knew that Quong Ma and Don Miguel de Moreno were dead. I suppose I must have fainted. When I returned to my senses once more, I found myself seated on the top of the stairs, and Consuelo's arms about me. There remains but little more to tell. At the time of that dreadful scene upon the battlements it was full tide, and though Nikola and I searched every nook and cranny along the coastline for many miles, the bodies of the two men could not be found. In all probability they had drifted out to sea. The same day I summoned up my courage and prepared to tell my sweetheart everything. But when I sought her out and was about to commence my confession, she stopped me. "Say nothing to me about it, dear," she began. "I cannot bear it yet. Dr. Nikola has told me everything. He exonerates you completely." "But what of ourselves?" I asked. "Consuelo, you and I are alone together in the world. Will you give me the right to care for your future happiness, my darling? Will you be my wife?" "When and where you please," she answered, holding out her hands to me and looking up at me with her beautiful, trusting eyes. I told her of my straitened means and how hard the struggle would be at first. "No matter," she answered bravely. "We will fight the world together. I am used to poverty, and with you beside me I shall know no fear." An hour later I had an interview with Nikola in the hall. "Ingleby," he said, "this is the end of our intercourse. I have tried my experiment, and though I have succeeded in many particulars, I have failed in the main essential. How much I regret what has happened I must leave you to imagine. But it is too late, for what is done cannot be undone. I have given orders that the yacht shall be prepared. She will convey you to Newcastle, whence you can proceed in any direction you may desire. One thing is certain, Dona Consuelo must leave this place, and as you are to be her husband, it is only fit and proper that you should go with her. I have only one wish to offer you. It is that you may be as happy as these past weeks have been sad." He held out his hand to me, and I took it. "We shall meet no more," he said. "Go away and forget that you ever met Dr. Nikola. Good-bye." "Good-bye," I answered. Without another word he turned and left the room. Shortly before midday we boarded the yacht. Steam was up when we arrived, and within a few minutes we were steaming out of the little bay. Consuelo and I stood together at the taffrail and looked up at the grim old castle above our heads. Standing on the battlements we could distinctly see a solitary figure who waved his hands to us. Then the little vessel passed round the headland, and that was the last we saw of Dr. Nikola. End of chapter 9. End of Dr. Nikola's experiment. Read by Peter Keeble, Nottingham, United Kingdom.